Okay, we are back for the sixth talk in the introductory unit of Advanced Environmental Science. And the last time we were talking about ecological footprint, how the Earth as a whole is now consuming more resources each year than the Earth produces each year. And I wanted to now go to a completely man-made system for a second and to think about it. And that is a spaceship. You can see I've written here the imperatives of a spaceship. If you're living on a spaceship, a number of things are immediately clear. There are systems in the ship that provide life support. And one of your jobs as a crew member is to maintain those systems in tip-top shape. The ship in tip-top shape means that you have a chance to survive. The second imperative is that all necessary materials for survival, except energy, are already on the spacecraft and cannot be replaced. You'll realize that with solar panels, we can collect energy from outside of the system of the spaceship. But everything else that we need is in the spaceship, cannot be replaced. So we have to safeguard as many of those materials for future use as possible. Finally, if you're on a spacecraft, everybody has to pitch in. There can't be any slackers on the spacecraft because maintaining the spacecraft will be a job that must be done carefully and for everyone. Now, I'm sure you've already figured out where I'm going with this. The Earth is literally a spaceship, right? It's a pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan called it, traveling through an utterly hostile and lifeless solar system. There is nothing out there that we can depend on. So the ecological footprint shows us that the human inhabitants of spaceship Earth are not meeting their obligations. In this course, we want to look at the reasons for this failure and also understand the magnitude of this failure. People still argue that humans can't possibly be exhausting the Earth's resources, can't possibly be affecting things as large as the climate. This idea of spaceship Earth was first proposed by a really out there thinker named Buckminster Fuller. And I just want to show you the book he wrote in the 60s when he really made people realize that the Earth was indeed a spaceship. And here's the book cover, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. I highly recommend that you do not read this book. He wrote it in almost indecipherable English. First chapter's okay, and then it gets really difficult to follow thereafter. Maybe you're have more intellectual agility than I, but I didn't get a whole lot out of the book, except for this big idea of Spaceship Earth. Now, last time at the end of the video, I said we're going to look at what are the commonly ascribed reasons for environmental problems. What'd you bet on, 5 or 6? Well, if you bet on 6, you're a winner. My hunch was right. I have changed it to 6 commonly asserted causes of environmental problems. And here they are. And we're going to try to go through them in rapid fire, although each one requires a lot of explication. I'm going to first go over all 6 briefly and then each one in detail. First one goes something like this. Humans are a dirty animal, like all animals, and our population is too large. We're out of balance with nature. And this is the population bomb argument. We have exploded in population. Number 2, affluence. We are too rich and we consume too much because the consumer demands it. This is the argument of affluence and consumer sovereignty, and I'll explain more of that because you probably don't know what consumer sovereignty means unless you've studied a lot of economics. 3, poverty. The desperately poor have no choice but to destroy this earth. It's too bad, but they're poor, and they just have to destroy the earth in order to eke out a living. This is the argument that poverty causes pollution. And I will say that an adaptation of this argument holds that environmental destruction has occurred in order to lift people out of poverty and feed a hungry world. And that argument is used a lot, and you hear that a lot in United Nations circles too, especially when underdeveloped countries are talking about their problems. 4, the harmful environmental costs of goods and services are not included in the price of those goods and services. So all we need to do is make sure that they are. This is the argument of external costs, that we just have to bring the cost of the problem inside the price and we will take care of a lot of problems. 5, when everyone acts in their own self-interest, nobody is looking out for the general good. This leads to what's called the tragedy of the commons. And a really interesting thinker just recently died, a professor at Colorado College, called this the tyranny of small decisions. And we'll return to that idea later. And finally, capitalism, our economic system. It's true, capitalism requires constant growth, which is to say exponential growth, and also encourages the tyranny of small decisions. This is called the problem with constant growth. Please note that none of these is a mutually exclusive hypothesis, so several may be operating at once. One may be the primary cause, on the other hand, and different environmental problems may have different causes, so one size doesn't fit all. It may be that each problem that we're going to study this year has a different one of these, or a different proportion of the blame could be ascribed to each one of these, or its own unique cause. And so we need to treat these as hypotheses, not as assumptions, and then examine each problem we study and look for which of these is the important one. So let's look at population first. That argument said all animals foul their environment, and the human population is now so large, we're going to see that on the next slide, that as a result, we are destroying the environment. And I would ask, is that true? Population is often assumed to be the cause of many environmental problems. So it's an underlying assumption. We need to examine that assumption. It seems logical, right? More people equal more needs for goods and service equals more consumption equals more waste. The big problem is that there's a lot of data that shows that affluent people consume a disproportionate share of resources, and this suggests that population per se is not the root cause of an environmental problem. Population may always exacerbate the problem, so we may find it's not the root cause, but it's exacerbating the problem, and we have to take that into account. The current population on Earth is 7.4 billion people. You should fact check me on that. Go online, find a population counter, and see if it's gotten to 7.5 over the summer. That's huge! Very few animal populations, especially large omnivorous animals, are that huge. But we're going to want to look carefully to see when and if population is the primary cause of an environmental problem. As I promised, here is a 10,000-year graph of human population. You can see that in the 20th and the 21st century, we have indeed gone into exponential growth, and where it will level off, well, we'll talk about that when we get to the population year. I just want to remind you about exponential growth. It's really important. You're Murray math students, and you guys are really good at math. Exponential growth occurs when a population, or when anything, grows by a constant percentage per unit time. It doesn't matter if that growth is 10%, 1%, or 0.1%. Eventually, you're going to get that J-curve. Current population on Earth is greater than 7.4 billion, and that is a number you need to know, if I didn't say that earlier. That is one of those facts that you just have to know for this course. 2, affluence. And the question we have to ask is, are the effects harmful or beneficial? You can make arguments either way. When we say affluence, we mean high rates of consumption per capita, and that's due to higher income. When people have higher income, they consume more. Affluence harms the environment by increasing levels of consumption, and that therefore increases the levels of pollution, and wealthier people tend to waste more resources anyway than poorer people, and so affluence has that negative effect on the environment. But affluence also has a positive effect on the environment. Better education, better health, more time to think about not just your survival, but how you want to live, what you want to be, leads people to care more about their environment, or not care more, but be able to act more about their environment. And it also provides funding to address pollution, environmental degradation, resource waste, etc. So affluence is a two-edged sword, and it will require a lot of study to see its effect. One version of this argument rests on the idea of consumer sovereignty, which says that it is consumers, not the owners of scarce resources, in other words, corporations in our modern world, that determine what final product should be produced from these resources. It's the demand of consumers. Pollution is the result of consumer demand because consumers want to increase their consumption, and they don't care if their demand causes environmental destruction. Now, I would say a history of the decisions over why certain products are produced by corporations invalidates this idea, yet you hear it all the time, and really intelligent people espouse it all the time. I think you can make the argument. I think it's just squid ink. It's still worthwhile, however, to think about how consumers might be made or might become a force to shape improvement of the environment in their decision to purchase alternative products. Much of the argument about consumer sovereignty is beyond the scope of this course. It belongs in an economics course. Poverty. Does poverty cause pollution? 20% of the world lives in poverty. They do not have their basic needs met. And I'm going to jump us to the next slide. Here we are on the next slide. Look at this. 2.6 billion lack adequate sanitation facilities. 2 billion people don't have enough fuel for heating and cooking. 2 billion people don't have electricity. 1.1 billion people lack access to clean water. 1.1 lack access to health care. 1 billion lack adequate housing. 1 billion lack enough food for good health. This is what we mean by poverty. About 1 in 8 people on the planet live in poverty. So we have seen what we mean when we say 20% of the world experiences some form of impoverishment that is extreme. The argument goes, these people in their desperation have no choice but to destroy the environment. Thus, it is commonly believed that poor people cause much of the environmental degradation that we see. But is this really true? And we'll have to look at it. You probably have some ideas already that in certain cases, for example, greenhouse gases, this is not true. Another take on poverty maintains that these nations have had to make decisions, the environment versus economic development. But is that really true? Is that just a justification for doing the kind of asset stripping that is being done in many developing countries, where a few people own those assets and are making a lot of money from them, and some people get jobs from them? Is that what's going on here? We'll have to look. In the current world economy, natural resources are simply valued at the cost to obtain them. Those are labor and capital costs. Any destruction of the environment or harm to people involved is generally not paid by the owner of the resource, even though other people pay them later on. This has been one of the reasons behind the union movement. This has been one of the things that the environmental movement has tried to do, make those real costs be paid up front. Here's an example. If a company pollutes a river and then the next town downstream has to build a water treatment facility, that is a real cost that the company is not paying. They're not paying for their pollution. Similarly, if workers are injured or get sick on the job from chronic exposure to something, let's say, the economic loss has typically been paid by the worker in terms of medical bills, or by society in terms of insurance. And we also have to figure in that the worker has lost income. Their working life has been decreased. And historically, companies have not paid these costs unless they are forced to do so by a government entity, a lawsuit, or I should say by a union, because unions have also been a powerful force in those kinds of reforms. Now, these real costs are called external costs or externalities. And this, I think, is one of the most important concepts you are going to learn in this course. I would put it in the top 10 most important concepts. Externalities. To reiterate, external costs include water and air pollution, disease, etc., that are paid by someone else, often in the future, not by the people who own the product of the production process that causes these real costs to be paid later on. That's an external cost. If external costs were included in the price of the product, that would increase the price of these technologies, and alternatives that were more environmentally friendly would become economical. And we're going to see this when we go to the energy unit. The prices of alternative energy sources are so close to the prices of oil-based energy products. If they were forced to pay their external costs, they would become prohibitively expensive, and we would go green like that. My friend Ken Dorff, who may come talk to us, who's a banker who works in the Middle East and Africa, he always says to me, Hugh, external costs are a taking. When Company A upstream pollutes water and Community B downstream has to pay to clean the water before use, that's a real cost by Community B. The real price of the product is being paid by Community B, and Company A is making that money in profit. And my friend Ken likes to ask, what is the difference between this and robbery? As a banker, he would say nothing. So forcing companies to pay external costs can reduce pollution. And is this enough? You already know what David Orr has to say about that. You can think back to technological sustainability versus ecological sustainability. I must also point out that the only logical entity to force companies to pay this cost upfront is a government entity. By that I mean some body that holds public interest at the forefront and has the ability to govern over a large jurisdiction. 5, the tyranny of small decisions. Let's talk about this. When each participant in society acts in their own self-interest, and you may remember that this idea originates from Adam Smith, the economist in the late 1700s, who came up with this idea before capitalism, our current economic system, even existed. When everyone acts in their own self-interest, the decisions they make may not be in the best interests of society as a whole. In other words, Adam Smith, it turns out, was not correct. We have a ton of data. For example, imagine a pasture on which independent sheep herders graze their sheep. It is in the best interest of each herder to have as many of her or his sheep on the pasture, but in doing so, the pasture will become overgrazed to the point where no one can produce any sheep. The entire system will be brought to ruins. This situation is referred to the tragedy of the commons. The commons being a common pool resource, that's a resource that nobody has to pay for, and the tragedy occurs when there is no restriction on the usage of a common pool resource. You can think of a lot of common pool resources, and maybe you want to stop the video right now and jot down a couple of ideas of common pool resources that are being overexploited. Okay, hopefully you did that. So this is the tragedy of the commons, and the tragedy of commons is just one example of the tyranny of small decisions. Each person making their small decision brings ruin to everyone. Economists have recognized that this is an example, one of many, where the free market fails. How does it fail? It fails to produce an outcome that is desirable for society as a whole. And the whole justification for the free market in the first place is that it is the most efficient way to distribute resources for society as a whole. This is known as market failure. And I just want to say that it's a lot bigger deal than the average economist, especially the average economist you're going to see on TV, would admit to. That's the tyranny of small decisions, which includes the tragedy of the commons. Let's go on to the 6th possible cause, capitalism and its constant growth. Our economic system is called capitalism. You should know what capitalism is, right? It's really important to know what capitalism is since you live in it. The whole idea is people with money, investors, turn their money over to corporations. And the corporations say to them, we will use your money to do something, and your money will grow. And at any time, you will be able to take your money back out, and it will grow. In addition, when you give them the money, you are part owner of that corporation. So in theory, you can influence its decisions. That is the idea. In theory, it's an interesting idea. You're loaning them your money. You're putting off consumption that you could do. And in theory, it's a great idea that your money should grow over time. But in order for your money to grow over time, you need to continually grow as a business, and the economy must continually grow. And we all have already seen in number 1, population, that constant growth is exponential growth in the long run. And constant growth has resulted in much of the observed environmental destruction. For example, many businesses rely on asset stripping, and this was a concept taught to me by a bird watching friend of mine who works for a bird conservation group. And asset stripping is the idea an abundant natural product is used beyond its sustainable yield just because it is profitable. Asset stripping. You are digging into capital of a natural resource as well as taking income. Can you think of examples where this has occurred? Very similar to the tragedy of the commons that we talked about before. So you may want to pause the tape and try to think. Give yourself 1 minute to come up with some examples. Constant growth is exponential growth, so it is a good question to ask how the economic system's need for constant growth can be made sustainable. Can you see how including external costs in the price of a product would help here? Does that make sense to you? But would it be enough? But can it be enough? This was the question that David Orr asked us when talking about ecological sustainability. So we always have to be looking at the effect of our economic system's need for constant growth. And if we're going to remain as a capitalist society, which David Orr suggests is impossible, if you want to save capitalism, you're going to have to find some way to make growth and the need for constant growth not environmentally damaging. Is there anybody doing anything out there about the environmental degradation on Spaceship Earth? I don't know that I'm going to answer that right now, but these thoughts came to me as a way of wrapping up this unit. To me, environmental problems show us that human technology is too powerful and human population is too large to allow the tyranny of small decisions to continue. The idea that each person can do whatever they want with the resources they own is no longer feasible. We require an entity that can weigh the interests of society and the interests of the planet and its non-human inhabitants against the individual interests of those that make the small decisions. In other words, there has to be a balance there. The entity must be able to internalize costs, set up a system in which costs are internalized, external costs are internalized, and it has to be free of influence by those who have a financial interest in environmentally destructive practices. If the last 150 years of free market economy has taught us anything, it's that there's a lot of money to be made by dipping into the capital, the natural capital of the earth. So we need an entity that can compel all members of the spaceship to work cooperatively. Because the crew on Spaceship Earth often forgets that it needs to work cooperatively. I will show you some videos to reinforce this point. Pretty humorous videos, I'm hoping. The entity that can do this is a government of some form. I don't think there's any other way to think about it. I know the people who have money to invest disagree, and they hire a lot of economists to argue the counterpoint. And if you want to know what that counterpoint is, turn on virtually any television channel, and you will hear it. I believe the creation of such a government will be the historic task of the next century. Well, that's it for the first unit. So let's quickly review what we've found. 1. The Earth is a system comprised of numerous other subsystems that support and permit life to exist on the planet. I think we've established that and talked about that, and you all are now a very good systems thinker. The Earth's systems have been negatively affected by human activity. Thus, we need to use systems thinking to analyze these problems and develop solutions. Hopefully that makes a lot of sense to you. The three big systems on Earth that support the ecosphere are the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere, and we started to understand them a little bit. And we're going to be talking about them all year long. 4. The natural resources and ecosystem services supplied by the Earth's systems are considered natural capital, and they're analogous to economic capital. Measured in economic terms, natural capital is incredibly valuable. We saw that conservative estimates are at least 10 times the value of the U.S. economy, the largest economy in the world. Human activities have grown to such a large scale and are so powerful that we are adversely harming the environment, which is a notion that would have seemed absurd even a century ago. Resources can be classified as renewable or non-renewable depending on how long it takes to generate them. You got that idea? Sustainability can be defined as using the Earth's resources at the rates at which they can be regenerated. Sustainable economy requires that not only must the environment be protected, but so too must all people be guaranteed equity of opportunity and a dignified standard of living. Otherwise, we who are green and wealthy have no right to tell others what they can and can't do with resources. Some people claim this will require a shift not just in technology, but also in our worldview. And that's why I gave you David Orr to consider. Our resource use can be measured as an ecological footprint that tells us how sustainable current resource use is. And we can look at that from our own point of view. How much do I as a person use? How much does my country use? And how much does the planet as a whole use? Each of those is informative. We should also look at per capita ecological footprint as well as total ecological footprint by region. Many causes have been proposed for why environmental problems occur and persist. For example, these are population, poverty, human nature, affluence, etc. We need to treat each one as a hypothesis and examine the data behind it. Because we literally live on a spaceship, it is the task of the current generation, all who are alive right now, to develop a sustainable society. But I put this on the current generation because the people who are already in the working world, their worldview is set. You all who are in high school will be developing what you really think as you become independent from your parents, how you want to be, how you want the planet to be. And you have these next 5 to 7 years to really radically change your mind and see a different future, and therefore change the world. The people who are above you, it's going to be hard to change them. You know how hard it is to change your own ability to learn things. The people above you have a vested interest in the way things are, have a lot of inertia, and you are going to be the ones to do it. So that's why I say it's the task of the current generation to develop a sustainable society. And that's all, folks.